to record. And here comes Bill. And here comes Albert. And all right. You guys already know what I'm going to ask, so I'm just not even going to ask. You guys are supposed to know what I'm going to ask. What am I going to ask?
What did we talk about last week?
Yep. Anybody remember?
We talked about the bubonic plague and kind of talked about what kind of led up to the Reformation and the Crusades.
The Crusades. We talked about the Black Death. Really one other sort of thing, because we sort of picked up in the middle of it, that was the Investiture Controversy,
Right.
which is who has the right to say who's going to be a bishop, a priest, a cleric in the various areas, and how this was a clash between church and state. And somebody asked, that I want to say that it was Sherry, either last week or the week before. Were you the one that asked about Cardinals? Am I remembering something?
Yeah, it was me.
And I presume you meant the title inside of the Catholic Church and not a baseball team from St. Louis, right? Because I could have answered the latter off the top of my head. But the first one other. So I'm actually going to start with that. So it's going to seem like a little detour, but it came out of the question there. And it is relevant to where we're going to get to today. So before I look over to the next slide, which I have the advantage of seeing that you guys don't have the advantage of seeing right now. When you hear cardinal inside the Catholic Church, what do you think of?
Authority. There's some level of authority, because I know, isn't it the college of cardinals that ultimately decides who the next pope will be?
Correct.
That's what I was going to say. The group of people that decide on the next pope.
And are they high or
church that-
low? Are they high or low in Catholic hierarchy?
Hi.
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 Yeah. And then that generally is most of what you probably need to know about cardinals, except for how they came to be. The term that's often applied to them, they're sometimes referred to as the princes of the church, meaning that they are the next level right below the Pope. If you want to think of the Pope in his authority as being sort of the equivalent inside of Christendom as a king or a monarch, the cardinals hold that next tier down, the role of princes. And the origin of the term is actually somewhat interesting. There's a little bit of disagreement over it, but the consensus seems to be that it comes from cardinalis, cardinalis from the word cardo, which means to pivot or to hinge.
Oh.
But
I
apparently,
would have guessed it was going to be heart. Cardio,
no,
not pivot or hinge.
yeah. And apparently it was first used in late antiquity. And I actually learned something here. I sort of generally knew this, but didn't know where historians drew the dividing line. Whenever we say antiquity, so when we say late antiquity, we are talking about antiquity runs to about 500 AD. So basically antiquity covers more or less the time as we get towards the time of and shortly after the date that's normally assigned to the fall of Rome. When the term medieval or Middle Ages is used, what generally do you think of that timeline as being, or that time frame as being?
500 to 1,000.
That's, more or less when I think Middle Ages, I would think the same. I used to think the same thing, Doug, and I have come to realize that generally most historians will talk about between 500 and 1500.
Wow.
Medieval. I think that, again, that's consensus, because I tend to think of by the time you get to the 14th and 15th century, so the 1300s and the 1400s, that you've moved out of what I think of being the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
And so they use these terms early, middle, I need to, thank you.
And late.
And late to distinguish inside of that. So for example, when you see here on the screen, late antiquity, they're talking about, the 400s and 500s, the 5th and 6th century. And so I just threw that in because it was something that I keep finding myself running into here. What does that term really mean? And what's interesting is that the term referred to this pivoted or hinge thing, referred to the fact that they were being incorporated into churches for which they had originally not been ordained. So if you think about the normal ordination process was someone would grow up in or be part of a church, and they would then be ordained by that church, and they would serve in that church. But for the Cardinals, in many cases here, they had been ordained elsewhere and had been brought into a particular church.
As a promotion, though, right?
Well, as the fact that they had come to Rome, and we'll see that a little bit here as we go through the history. I don't want to detour too far on this, but it was raised, and again, it does have relevance to what we're talking about.
Isn't that kind of like what we do in our Baptist church?
Yeah, it's not uncommon to recognize the ordination of someplace for someplace else, but I just thought that was an interesting thing here, is that the term came from the fact that they were sort of not from that church originally. They were being, I'm not even sure I fully grasp how pivot or hinge gets tied into that. It's like they were being connected into it. So originally the first cardinals were 7 deacons that were actually in the city of Rome. So they had created a model sort of around the early church, the first century church concept of deacons. And the deacons were ones who basically served or assisted with papal activity there in Rome. And so the deacons, who were essentially the first cardinals, these 7 deacons in Rome, as it says, were granted the privilege of wearing a different vestment, a different outfit because of their role. And they had direct access to the Pope, whereas others in the city, the presbyters, who had positions of authority in churches in Rome, didn't necessarily have that same privilege. So that's one of the first things that we see being distinct here. We're going to discover, this is the other thing I learned in going back and researching this, there are different types of cardinals. Cardinal is not a cardinal is not a cardinal. There's really like 3 categories. But again, in the 6th century, so this is the 500s, we see the first ones. By the time of, on the right place, stop. By the 8th century, the term had sort of grown out to be larger, and it was attached to a senior priest or the senior pastor in each of the titular churches of Rome. So there were a lot of churches in Rome. So the churches in Rome proper, and then the churches that were in Roman Catholicism by this point. The term cardinal sort of represented that highest person inside of whatever church. And we're going to talk about Lateran Councils today. The Lateran Council of 769 was the first place that said only a cardinal priest or a cardinal deacon was eligible to become pope. So there were cardinal priests, who were those that were recognized, and there were these groups.
Another noise, somebody coming in.
Yeah, and then there were these other. Well, there, and then there were these other the deacons that were there.
Oh.
So the cardinal deacons were the 7 sort of original ones there in Rome. The cardinal priests were the larger thing. And notice that you had to be a cardinal to be a pope. That's no longer the case. Any Catholic male now can become pope, but laity could not participate in the election. And during this period of time for the election of popes, it would go back and forth by how widely or how narrowly they allowed the elections to come. So this decision of this council in 769 was an important part of sort of establishing not only who was going to elect, but who could be elected, at least at that time.
And wait a second, the term presbyters is really more like just priests in the first paragraph?
Leaders inside of local congregations.
So we're talking about the early Middle Ages now, right?
Very good, very good. Look at Billy applying that knowledge.
And who elects these people?
They were generally and still are generally elevated to that position by the Pope. So the Pope decides the people who decide the Pope is one way of looking at that.
Hey, Don,
Mm-hmm.
how much interaction did the cardinals actually have with the church membership?
I would say a lot based upon what I've seen and what I've read. I think it's a fair thing to say at that time, there was not maybe as much of a detachment between the rank of cardinal and the, if you will, the average everyday parishioner. Over time, it's a very fair thing to say that became more and more and more and more divided.
So, and the people really had no choice on who was elected to any of those positions, including the Pope.
They did, in the sense that they did have some role, and it seems to vary from what I've read and understand by the local custom and sort of how things were supposed to be and how they really were. It was not uncommon for a local church, even still the local large churches, those recognized bishoprics that we talked about that were there, Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, for them still to have a lot of control over who got ordained.
Mm.
That was still, and you had to be ordained eventually to be elevated.
Okay.
Good question. By the 9th century, just sort of okay, and they're back. By the 9th century, just a side note here, all 7 cardinal now bishops were bound to sing mass on rotation at the high altar at St. Peter's Basilica. So this is sort of in here because there's a mention in this decree of the cardinal bishops, the cardinal priests, and the cardinal deacons. So we sort of get a sense on what the cardinal establishment was, because of this interesting thing of saying you guys get to rotate who's responsible for singing mass at St. Peter's every 7th Sunday. This continued on into the 11th century, and so in 1059, Nicholas II gives cardinal bishops the right to elect the Pope under a papal bull. The emperors could not nominate candidates nor veto a winner. Look at the timing of this, 1059. What's just happened right before this?
Schism.
Schism.
Great schism.
The Great Schism, the East-West
East and
Schism.
West.
And so who nominated popes before the schism? The emperor in the East, remember? And that's part of why they went back and forth. So this is clarifying the fact that no longer is it going to be the process of we're dependent upon the emperor that's in Constantinople to nominate, no longer are we dependent for them to nominate the candidate, nor can they say no to who we've chosen. Now, if they want to say yes, they can still confirm. We're good with that. And notice where the election must take place. In Rome. That actually is going to get to be a little bit of an issue over some of the schisms, the papal schisms that will arise over the next couple of centuries. But that was clarified as well. And the Pope is the Pope from the moment of election, not from coronation or enthronement. So as soon as the right people say he's the Pope, he's the Pope. He doesn't have to go through something else in order to be the Pope.
So that sounds like the first step in separation of church and state.
Well, it's the first step in this case, making sure the church is saying it has superior authority to the state.
Well, and it's the West kind of saying
We're done with the East.
The East is.
We're done with the East.
We don't care
Yeah.
what the East does anymore.
Right. At the Third Lateran Council, 1179, the whole body of cardinals to elect the Pope was reestablished. We're actually going to talk about that a little bit more. Later, a 2/3 majority becomes required. So they continue to clarify who has the right to name and elect the Pope. You wonder why they wear red hats? Because that was granted to them by Pope Innocent IV in 1244 to allow them to be distinct. And then the number of cardinals rose to 65 by 1517 as additional ones were added. 31 were added. That was sort of a political thing going on. We'll eventually get to that. Timing on this. We haven't hit this date yet, but it's an important date. Anybody know what that 1517 is? I got 95
Reformation.
sentences. There's a door. I got a hammer.
Reformation.
Martin Luther.
That's the start of the formal start of the Reformation with Luther attacking the 95 Theses. So Leo adds to the College of Cardinals because of the political implications of what's going on with the Reformation. Now there's a total of 65 of them. They do cap the number at 70 shortly after that, and it's 6 cardinal bishops, 50 cardinal priests, and 14 cardinal deacons now. So the 70 is based upon the concept of the number 70 appears constantly in Scripture, goes back to the concept of the Sanhedrin, Moses's ways that things were governed in the desert. So this becomes the cap. Now eventually they exceed 70 under John the 23rd, and so in 1965, when that happens under Paul VI, they increased the number of cardinal bishops when they gave rank to the patriarchs of the Eastern Catholic churches, not to be confused here with Eastern Orthodox churches, churches in the eastern part of Catholicism. And by 1970, the number had been capped at 120. They also put the maximum age for cardinal electors in at the age of 80. And so if you are over the age of 80, you cannot vote for the next pope. You're still a cardinal, but you're not allowed to vote. And so as a result, when Benedict stepped down, there were 115 of the 117 cardinals that were under the age of 80, and there are more than 117 cardinals. 115 participated at that conclave. One because it didn't participate because of scandal, the other because of health. So the point of going through that little exercise is the number and organization of the cardinals has changed over time.
On after the 1500s, what era do you call that?
That would be modernity. That would be modern.
Okay.
And so we don't know if we're in early, middle, or late modern. I guess we should hope we're still in early modern. I don't know. All right. Kathy hates this part. We're going to look at some dates just to remember where we've been and where we're going. So this is a collective quiz we're taking together. No one can fail, but just to see how well we remember sort of the general flow of things before we jump into the next thing. So the period from 33 to 62 AD, what's going on then?
It'd be early antiquities.
Oh boy, got going on a theme here now.
Is that when the groups were coming into the regions?
Well, it's the disciple
It's
period.
a very, yeah.
basically.
It's really the events that we have recorded in Acts, more or less.
Oh, okay, okay.
We didn't actually describe these as dates in a classic sense, but obviously it's post crucifixion and resurrection. That's AD 30 to AD 33, depending on sort of which timeline you want to follow. And most scholars agree that by the time of about AD 60, we've reached the end of the book of Acts, mainly because of what Luke does not record in Acts. We know what he did record. We know where Paul was, but we know when other events in history happened that we sort of assume that Luke would have recorded that he didn't, which happened right after this. So we generally think that the book of Acts runs through about 62 AD. And so we will take that as that timeline. And so what is one of the events? Does anybody remember? If you don't, wouldn't shock me if you don't remember this. But what is the event in 62 AD that we did talk about?
Is this the uprising in Rome?
Not yet.
70 AD was the turning point of losing the temple. So this is probably the beginning of rebellions in Israel.
Not quite
Is
yet.
this the death of Oh, James. Okay.
It's the execution of James. So this is the Christ's half-brother, James the Just, which sort of is an indicator of what's going on inside of the relationship with the early church and the state and Palestine as well. So 64 AD.
Don, do you have two microphones turned on there?
I do not. I'm picking up background noise from somebody, but I don't know who.
Okay.
64 AD. These get easier, by the way. That's when the persecutions actually do begin under Nero. And it's actually during the Nero persecutions that both Peter and Paul are executed, with approximate dates being about this time or shortly thereafter. 66 AD. Kathy says that's the start of the uprising in Jerusalem. And she's right. This is the Jewish revolt. It's also when Christians flee Jerusalem. Remember that by the time we get to the events of the next couple of years, Christians are not going to be in Jerusalem or what happens next. All right. 70. AD 70.
Fall of the temple.
Say it out loud, Kathy.
Fall of Rome, fall of the temple.
Temple destroyed.
Right. It's fall of Jerusalem and the temple is destroyed. Yeah, very important date. All right. Around, so circa 100 AD. Kathy knows because she had the preview of the quiz yesterday, so she's not allowed to answer. It's generally recognized as about the time of the death of John. So it's the last of the apostles. So that represents the end of what is commonly referred to as the apostolic age, because he's the last apostle. 312.
Kathy, you can give hints because you're sitting behind Don. He can't see.
A sign on the road in the sky, but he was on a bridge. Somebody was on a bridge. He was
Council of something.
no, not yet. Not yet. I said the same thing, Bill.
This is the Battle of Milvian Bridge, which is when Constantine
Gets the sign in the sky.
by this sign conquer. So it's considered to be the conversion of Constantine, which we know is going to be very important. So Constantine becomes the sole emperor through his conversion, or begins the process of becoming the sole emperor. 325. Go, Bill. You're
I was
close.
going to say, go, Bill.
That's the Council of Nicaea. And we remember what the main thing the Council of Nicaea was called to deal with?
Arianism.
Kathy says Arianism. Who agrees with her?
Yes.
Yes. 381 is the Council of Constantinople, where they come back together, clean up the Nicene Creed, and again, further sort of define elements of the Trinity and particularly deal with Arianism yet again. Then we get to 451. Guesses, anyone?
I thought it was 450.
This is the last of the three early ecumenical councils, which is the Council of Cal Sadon, or Chalcedon. At Chalcedon, remember, that's where they do the definition of who Jesus is in his humanity and divinity, not just the divinity side of things. 476.
Is that the fall of Rome?
That is the fall of Rome. Mickey wins the prize. The formally recognized fall of Rome. Rome's been falling for decades before that, but that's when it formally is sacked and is considered to be the official, if you will, fall of Rome. There's no longer any Roman emperor in the West. That's why that date's normally chosen. 800. Man, we jumped farther forward.
Christmas Day, 800.
What happened?
Sherry's having a welcome back Cotter Horseshack moment.
Charlemagne?
Charlemagne. What happens to Charlemagne on Christmas Day in 800?
He's crowned Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire.
Correct. And as one of the lectures I was listening to yesterday references that old joke about it's neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, but still we call it that. So yeah, Charlemagne crowned as the Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope. Again, we talked about this coming as at the end of sort of this relationship that existed between the papacy and political sort of the rise of, the Pope being able to put someone in this position in the case of Charlemagne as the leader of the Franks. 1054.
The schism?
The schism,
Correct.
the break between the Eastern and Western churches. The Great Schism, as I prefer to call it. It could also be called the East-West Schism. 1096. Is the launching of the First Crusade.
Oh.
Oh.
Actually called for in 1095, actually gets on the road in 1096. And then the last date, we're going to pick up with, so we've covered a lot. We've covered over 1,000 years of history. Be proud of yourself. That's why it seems like it's taken us forever to get here. So now I'm going to bring us up to a new date. When I say 1215, does that have any significance for anyone?
Magna Carta?
Yes.
No.
Yep.
Who was it? Okay.
The Magna Carta. So, Bill, what is the Magna Carta?
I don't remember.
It
I know it was
was
an
telling,
form of government.
it was telling the King John that the English nobility had certain rights that he could not infringe upon.
Yeah. There is.
Right.
How many King Johns have there been in English history?
One.
Anybody know? One. Will there ever likely be another King John in English history?
No.
Probably not.
Probably not. That's how bad a King John was, that we use the term to describe an outhouse or a bathroom.
Is it John?
Yep. And which is where that comes from.
I'll be darned.
And that there's never been another King John, despite the fact that John is one of the most common names in the English language. Tells you maybe everything you need to know about John, even without having to know anything about John. But 1215, for most students of history, if you throw that date out, the immediate place they'll go is Magna Carta, for good reason, because it eventually becomes quite influential. It's the basis for a lot of things that are that eventually become English common law, which for us as Americans is important because we derive our understanding of a lot of legal process through English common law. And as Mickey well said, it was a settlement really between John as king and 25 of his barons about what John could do with and without his consent. And so it limited the power of the monarch in a lot of different ways. It should be noted, it's often said that John signed the Magna Carta. Not true. He actually didn't sign it, he only put his seal on it. And less than 5 weeks after it was quote unquote sealed, he was actively engaged in trying to undo it. And part of his active engagement in how to undo it actually involved the church. Because what John had actually done prior to this, after, by the way, he had been excommunicated by the Pope over an investiture controversy type of issue, he got back into the good graces of the Pope at that time, Innocent III, by agreeing to the person that he wanted to place in the position of Archbishop of Canterbury, and he also paid basically a tithe or a tribute back to the Church of Rome, a bribe, and he put England under the papacy as a fiefdom in the feudal concept of what a fief was. So when
Fief or
fief, F-I-E-F, meaning that it was subject to Rome. So when he then tried to use that as his way to get out from under what he didn't want to do with these barons, and we won't chase that political aspect very far, except to say that most people now, when they look back in time, think of the big event in 1215 being the Magna Carta. At the time, it was a footnote that really, first of all, the rights that we derive from that as citizens were not contained in that. The rights that were given there were given to the barons. It's only over time that those are extended down to people that weren't nobility. But the point I'm trying to make is that in 1215, yeah, people recognized this thing happened over in England, but that was not the big thing, as the lecturer I was listening to yesterday would have said. If you ask people in 1220, what's the biggest thing that's happened in the last 5 years, they would not have said Magna Carta. In fact, they wouldn't even know how to refer to it as the Magna Carta. That's even a term that we use to attach to it later. So if that wasn't the big event in 1215, does anybody know what the big event was in 1215? And it relates to what we're studying. It's actually the fourth Lateran Council. So
wait a minute. How many of y'all had heard about Lateran Councils before today?
Not me.
Not me either.
Me neither.
how many of you at least heard the term Magna Carta before today?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Oh, yeah.
Carta.
Yeah. So, first of all, the fact that it's the fourth Lateran Council, and we haven't even talked about the other three yet, maybe says something. But I'll be honest with you, I was familiar with the term Lateran Council, but not the importance of this particular one, nor the timing of this particular one until we got into this study. So I think we're all pretty much in the same boat. If you were raised Catholic, you probably have more of an appreciation and understanding of both just the history of ecumenical councils and also particularly the importance of the fourth Lateran Council. So today we're going to talk about the fourth Lateran Council because it's very, very important. And it also continues us along the timeline. And basically, this is the last place we're going to officially sort of stop in terms of history things before we actually hit what really all of this has been leading to, which is the Reformation. Because this sort of sets the final, most of the final pieces in place, not all, but most of the final pieces in place for where things stand by the time we get to 1517. So today we're going to talk about the Lateran Councils. Any questions about what we've come through so far?
Hey, Don, I was reading about the Magna Carta. It says that also in that same year, 1215, that the Pope declared the Magna Carta invalid.
That's correct.
On August the 24th.
It was signed. Misnomer. John didn't sign it. He sealed it only because he didn't want to sign it. And he immediately appealed to the Pope as to whom to he owed fealty, the fiefdom thing, to invalidate it. Because part of what also went on inside of that was there was a little bit of language in there about what the king could and could not do with respect to religious and clerical offices. The bottom line was John was a horrible king who was a horrible military commander who constantly were taxing the nobles and trying to tax the church to fund things, and the barons just eventually said enough is enough. And he's an interesting character in history. He's an interesting. How many of you have ever seen the movie The Lion in Winter with Peter
Oh, yeah.
O'Toole, and Katharine Hepburn.
One of my favorites.
If you know that, yeah, it was a stage play and then done as a very good movie. That is Henry II that is portrayed there by Peter O'Toole. Katharine Hepburn plays Eleanor of Aquitaine. And it's basically, it's a story about the dysfunctional royal family of England is what it is. Yeah. And a lot of you would recognize many of the actors that are in there. There's a young Anthony Hopkins, but in that movie, John, who is the youngest, he's the fifth oldest of the sons, who's the youngest son, is played there, and he's played sort of as almost if he has some form of mental disability, which probably accurately portrays how a lot of people thought about John. He was originally called John Lackland because he was originally not going to have any land left after the other four older brothers got what they got to inherit, and then by sets of circumstances, he ends up actually being the king. So I do recommend that. It's a 68, 69 movie period piece, but it's very compelling, and you get a better sense on John by doing that. But
how long did he remain king after the Magna Carta?
Not very. I don't have those dates in front of me, but not very.
It didn't sound like it.
He died from dysentery like I want to say 12, 18, but I may have the date wrong. And he died from dysentery while he was leading a military campaign in France. And basically at the time that he assumed the throne, everything except the most northern parts of the British Isles and Ireland were England, but they also controlled all of what my daughter would call the left side of France. Aquitaine, Normandy, all of those areas there. It's called the Evangeline Empire, was huge. And by the time we get to 1215, John had lost basically everything except about 3 cities and a small duchy on the continent, and was in financial trouble. That's how good of a king he was.
And he became king because of Richard, right?
Because Richard, yeah, exactly. And that ties back to, remember, I talked about the Crusades.
Right.
Yeah.
Richard didn't come back.
Yeah, and Richard never really wanted to be king. And he sort of, Richard spent virtually none of his time as king inside of England. He was always off somewhere. And John actually rebelled at one point against his father, and then John rebelled against Richard. It's an interesting little period of English history that plays down tremendously to us today. Again, the Magna Carta being, when it was here a couple of years ago, we actually went and saw it at one of the copies of it at the museum, and that was, pretty impressive thing to do.
Yeah.
Today we're going to talk. Go ahead.
Can you describe the Crusades in just a few words?
See if I can do the good 4-sentence summary. The Holy Land had been lost to Islam, to the forces of Islam, and to Arabs. Pope Urban II, along with others, said what we need to go do is we need to go take the Holy Land back. And so they launched a series of military campaigns to go and reconquer the Holy Land. Is that a fair, simple summary? Anybody want to add to that?
And these were Christians per se that were on the offensive.
Correct.
There were 7, right? 7 crusades, not just one. I just kind of thought the crusades were more like a period rather than this one, then this one, then this one, then this one. I rewatched last week's, I was thinking
There we go.
I was thinking there were 7, but maybe there were kind of some that weren't.
There were 9, and that depends on whether you count the Children's Crusade, which really wasn't organized by any adult leadership, as what it says. It sort of was a bunch of kids decided, we're going to go. And Billy, we do have there on the Sunday School's website. We've been recording classes now for about 6 weeks.
Okay.
And we did cover the Crusades last week, not in as much depth as we could have covered them, but you can get a little more there too.
Okay, thank you.
You watch that.
I get the impression that the Crusades as a period and as a historical event is not given as much attention in modern, well, in more recent historical studies as they were even when I was in high school. I remember that the Crusades were emphasized. I don't remember a lot about them, unfortunately, but I do remember that they were emphasized, I think, as probably a cultural war between the West and the East. And so, and now I get the impression that they are not emphasized nearly as much.
I think and in fairness, by the way, I think the more modern, postmodern interpretation of the Crusades is to look at them from a modern point of view or a modern optic about the genocides that came as a result of them and the clash of cultures and essentially a concept that I think they're viewed more critically. I'll just put it that way. Whereas I think an earlier version of the way that the Crusades were often taught almost goes back, real early version of that goes back to the original idea, which was it was rightful Christians going back to take what should have never been taken from them in the first place, kind of rationale, the thing that was behind it. And the truth lies all over between those two extremes and in the middle, because there were, a good example is the character of Richard, and I talked about Saladin, who was the Arab leader during the Third Crusade. They came to an agreement, a truce over access to Jerusalem. That I don't think that's as widely taught, or was as widely taught as the success of the First Crusade, where they actually did seize Jerusalem for a period of time. And nobody really wants to talk as much about that Fourth Crusade, where they never quite made it to the Holy Land, but decided, we can sack Constantinople. That's just as good. And so they are a very controversial period. But the reason we covered them last week, if you remember, we talked about them, is they do lay the backdrop for a lot of this period of time that we're talking about. They're going on. When Kathy called it a period, it was a period of time over several hundred years, and this crusade fervor existed throughout that entire period of time in various waves of that. And we're actually going to see that in the Fourth Lateran Council as well. So first of all, let's take a little detour. The setting of the Lateran Council, the reason it's called a Lateran Council is it's in the Lateran Palace, which is right next, by the way, to the Lateran Basilica, which is there in Rome. And so this became a place, particularly popular place, which we're going to see when we go through these Lateran Councils for about 100 years there, that this was the place they called the meetings together and held the councils. Another quick sidebar on this, a little detour, we didn't talk about the donation of Constantine. Does anybody know what the donation of Constantine is?
No.
It was a document which claims that Constantine wrote, and essentially in writing, with the transfer of the empire from Rome to Constantinople, that he gave some things back to the Bishop of Rome that were no longer needed because he was moving the capital to Constantinople. And so one of the things that is donated is the Lateran Palace, which is handed over to the church. And so the other thing about the donation of Constantine is it was later used as justification for the Pope exercising political authority in Rome, because he had been given that authority back when the empire was moved by Constantine. So it was a justification for papal temporal authority in the area of Rome. And so it became something that was sort of, and oh, by the way, yes, all of this, and Constantine said we should have this authority, and it was demonstrated by the handing over of some of the properties in Rome from the empire to the church.
Don, does Lateran refer to a pope?
Or no, it's just the name of the palace, as far as I understand it.
Okay.
And so again, this donation of Constantine is a document that was supposedly written from Constantine to one of his officials, Sylvester. It was presented to Pepin II in the late 8th century when they were trying to convince Pepin to hand over the lands that eventually became the Papal States. They said, hey, remember, Constantine gave his donation in the form of this. Why don't you give us your, what's later called the donation of Pepin, is what is part of what's given there the justification for Pepin handing over the Papal States. Say that 3 times fast. And it's then quoted again by Leo the Ninth. Notice the date, in 1054. This is about the authority thing between the East and the West. And eventually it's first challenged as, and eventually sort of proven to be most likely a forgery. Almost everyone agrees now it's a forgery in doing this for Billy's benefit now. This would be the late Middle Ages, 1450. So I just wanted to throw that in as a side because we hadn't talked about it. It may pop up again, but why it's relevant is this is why they're meeting in the Lateran Palace for these councils.
Is that the basilica?
The basilica's on, as I understand, the basilica's on the left, and this is the palace on the right, is what I understand. They're connected.
Oh,
That's the basilica, not that domed thing back there?
I believe that's correct. Anyone who's been to Rome who knows better than me, please correct me.
huh.
All right. So after taking that little detour, let's get back to not just where the councils were, but what they were. So again, there were 4. There actually is a 5th that comes later. We'll eventually hit it because it's tied to the Reformation. But the 4 here are the ones that we're going to cover first and lead up into the 4th, which is very important. The first was in 1123. Last week, remember, we talked about the Investiture Controversy, who has the right, the king or the pope. Remember, they came to a settlement called the Concordat of Worms, where they sort of agreed how they would share that authority and that the papacy would ultimately have the authority to appoint. Shortly after that, 1122, they get a bunch of folks together for a Lateran Council, and they affirm that. What we just agreed to is, in fact, the case, and they were happy to do it because who essentially won, at least at that point, the Investiture Controversy? Who had the right to make the appointments?
Pope.
The church, right. The Pope and the church.
Yeah. Yeah.
Also, though, in this Lateran Council, the first one, they start clarifying the relationship of clerics, meaning priests and other, with respect to celibacy and relations with women. So, for example, it was clearly stated in this particular Lateran Council, a priest could not live in the same house with women unless they were mother, sister, or aunt, and basically he was living there because he needed to care for them. So they were starting to make sure that there was a clear understanding, for example, that a priest should not be living outside of marriage with a woman, which apparently was somewhat common. In fact, we're going to talk about marriage here as we move along, because we think of marriage now in a modern context of marriage. The way that marriage worked in now the middle to late Middle Ages was a little bit different for a lot of folks, day in, day out. So the first council covered a very narrow thing, which really was just to reaffirm the Concordat of Worms and the settlement to the Investiture Controversy. A couple of decades later, they have the Second Lateran Council. It primarily met to settle a very short-lived papal schism where there had been competing elections and there were 2 popes again. It's amazing how many times this actually happens over a couple of 100 years. In this case, it was Innocent II and Anacletus II, who had both been elected in 1135. Anacletus is eventually deemed to be the improperly elected antipope.
I can hear that.
And so what happens, I don't know who may need to mute this there, the council has to meet to figure out and settle up the concept of what do we do for all of these clerics that were appointed by Anacletus when he claimed to be Pope, but he's not really Pope. And so how do we deal with that? And so they came back with basically saying those people are not properly ordained, properly recognized. And so this council more or less, it dealt with some other things, but that's the primary thing it did, was settle this dispute that had arisen over where they'd ended up with 2 popes. Any question about that?
And it's because of the east and west problem.
This was not the East-West problem. This is after the East-West. This is inside of the Western Church that they've managed to elect 2 popes.
Well, how did they end up with 2 popes?
Because in the case of this particular one with Innocent II and Anacletus, Innocent II was elected by the majority of the College of Cardinals at that point, but there was a minority group inside the College of Cardinals who opposed his election, so they went off and elected their own Pope, Anacletus.
Oh my God, this sounds too much like present day.
Both politically and then sometimes
Yes.
inside the church too, right?
Yes.
Yep. In 1179, they had actually one of the larger councils in terms of attendance. Notice it had been 40 years since the last one. Guess what they're back to do? Got another papal schism. We got to settle here. Keep having this problem of electing 2 popes. And here they went further to clarify that only cardinals could elect a pope. So if we really define who the group is, who can properly elect, maybe we'll stop having this problem. And notice they made it more than a simple majority. It's now a 2/3 vote to elect the pope. So some of these other instances were where there had been a very narrow majority, and that's why the minority went off and did something else. Now we're only going to declare somebody if there's a super majority, at least a 2/3 vote. They outlawed simony, which is the sale of church offices, which had become a problem. Yes, the church, what typically was happening here, sort of what had come as a result of the Concordant of Worms, was that generally speaking, unless there was an objection, the political authorities and the local authorities were pretty much for the most part suggesting who should have the office, and then the church was approving that and basically rubber stamping it in a lot of instances. But so that meant that there still was the case for the influence of money getting into play about who would be recommended and thus who would be approved or invested with the office. They also expressly forbade any arming or sending weapons or providing any aid to any Muslim power. Remember what we're moving into now here is we're into in the middle of the period of the Crusades. It forbade Saracens, which is sort of a European term to describe Muslims, and Jews from having Christian slaves. By the way, didn't condemn slavery, just said only Christians can own other Christians.
Who was sending arms to the Muslim powers?
I didn't dig into that, but there was some controversy about some folks, like modern arms dealers, playing both sides and actually equipping and arming. Because, again, the Crusades are going on. There's money to be made in arming the forces. Yep, go ahead. Somebody?
Probably Venice.
Would not surprise me at all if it were Venice.
Yeah, Venice and some of the other Italian states.
They were pretty smart about playing both sides there. And then they condemned Catharism as a heresy. We'll come back and talk a little bit about that more later because it'll show up as we really get into the Reformation. But this was primarily existing in Italy and parts of France. And it very much was similar, if we go back to what we've studied before, to that Gnostic concept of duality. And there's a good and a bad. In fact, the Cathars sort of believed that there was a good God and a bad God. And so they still were in or claimed to be Christian, but they had very different non-Orthodox views. And so they were firmly condemned as a heresy.
So what offices, other than Pope, Cardinal, Bishop, what positions were for sale?
All of those.
So those were the ones. Those are the ones that were for sale.
Yeah, bishop, archbishop, cardinalship. This is also on the verge of moving into the period right after, particularly Innocent III, of the really, really, really bad corrupt popes. So
are we to consider what we're talking this church we're talking about now, Christian church?
Oh yeah, this is still the church.
when we say Catholic, it's still not the Catholic church that I think of as the Catholic church. We're still talking about the church in total.
Well, at this point, it still is because we're pre-Reformation.
Right. When I think of the divisions, I didn't realize really that there weren't Presbyterians and Baptists and all of that stuff. I mean, it was stupid for me to not think that there was that, but
this is
still one church, one Christian
the little
church.
the little C Catholic meaning universal eventually will be the big C Catholic, also meaning universal, but now distinct from
the other
Protestant movements.
Approximately what year does that happen?
The Reformation
15.
officially considered to start 1517.
Okay.
So we're still 350 years roughly short of that.
So basically, I'm kind of with Kathy on her thought that she just said. So basically, I guess, I don't know, it's just weird to me that, although I understand this was the formation and ongoing of the church, but that outside of what we've talked about, there weren't maybe others that were more like how we think today, you know, like, but I understand because it was a process, you know, from the time that Christ ascended to figure it all out.
Yeah, and I think you've raised a good point here, and this is something that I wanted to say. I just wasn't quite sure where I was going to put it in, so here's as good a place as any. Because the history that we've been studying primarily focuses on the organization and leadership of the church, meaning what's going on at the top levels of the church, I think it is easy to want to assign a lot of the quote unquote sins and defects in the church to the church as a whole. For the average person in a small village in Europe at this time, they were going to church every Sunday. Their needs, for the most part, were being met by the local cleric, by the local priest, in unbelievably positive ways. They were not, you know, yes, they were aware of these things that were going on at the highest levels. And yes, they may have had their positions on it. And they certainly had doctrinal positions that they may have been worried or concerned about and what they were being decided. But I think it's easy during this period of time and I get this label in my head and it's wrong, to just think of it as the corrupt church because of the corruption that was going on at the highest levels where it had become, as Billy well pointed out, more political than religious in a lot of ways that we would think about it. Although, having said that, it's interesting when you read biographies of Innocent III, who is a very political character. We're going to run into him here a lot. But you see some things even in his politics, he sincerely believed the things that he believed. It wasn't for a lack of sincerity. You may look at his sincerity and go, that's misguided. But it was sincere. And I think it's easy to lose that because we're hitting the things that we view as being all the negatives. And by definition, we're not talking about the positive things that were going on every day. The church continued to be the church. The church today, even in the midst of scandal and strife, continues to do the things that it does that don't show up on the news every night. Right? I mean, what's going to show up on the news? You're going to see some scandal or some fall. You're not going to see the good the church, the millions of good things the church will do just today. Through not its organized fashion, but through the believers.
Well, we got to remember that these people were relatively uneducated. I mean, and the educated people were in the church, so they kind of bullied them.
That's true.
Well, and
they didn't have as much availability of the written word.
Right.
Well, and the fact that it's not like the news of what's happening in Rome is going to get to the local congregation of the church in, I don't know, pick a place, it's not even going to get to them maybe for a year through, you know, travel and stuff like that. So how is it going to affect me if I'm some local, you know, farmer's wife in some, I don't even know where to pick a place. But if I'm not in Rome, if I'm not in, you know, where these palaces and places are, how is what's decided there in 1215 really going to affect how I go to church on Sunday? And
it is going to affect when the word comes down through the hierarchy to your local priest to relay to you that this is how it's going to be. But to Kathy's point, there was no reporter standing in where that lamppost is in front of this with a backdrop reporting, here's what went on today inside the Fourth Lateran Council.
right, and getting the word out to the church, that's like even the whole thing about going back to the councils, you know, the Arianism thing persists today.
Correct. We talked about the modern inheritors of the most relevant expression of Arianism is, well, there's two in various forms, the Jehovah's Witness and the Latter-day Saints. The Mormon Church has a different flavor of it, but still a flavor of it. Yep. So again, I'm glad you brought up that point, Donna, because it's easy to think about the corrupt church because of what we've been studying and not thinking about the other part. And also, we will get into this. Yeah, we will get into this question of what's going on with doctrine in the laity. And, you know, for example, what we believe today, where was that during this period of time? We're going to talk about that when we get into the Reformation. Because particularly as Baptists, there are two views on this. One has become a very minority view, which is that we can trace back our own sort of version of apostolic succession in Baptist doctrine all the way back to the first century church, and the other being that we grew out of an element of the Reformation. I hold to the latter view, that we grew out of an element of the Reformation, but that it was reaffirming a first century church true doctrine.
Heretic.
Yeah, I'll say up front, I don't subscribe to the trail of blood in terms of Baptist history. I'm aware of it, and we will talk about it, but I don't subscribe to it. I think it takes some things for granted that shouldn't be. But those are the two broad concepts of even how we got to be where we are as Baptists. That we come out of a Reformed tradition, or that we were always outside of all of this, and that's our tradition there as well. We'll talk about that. We'll give both their due. We'll give both their day. But we'll look at that.
The Trail of Blood was in one of the Crusades.
No, the Trail of Blood is a book/pamphlet that was written by someone to assert the position that Baptists, particularly Baptists, came out of a direct connection back to the first century church.
Do you have a copy of it?
I do have a copy of it.
That was one of the first things that Karen's dad gave me, and I'm not sure what I did. I'm sure I still have it someplace, but I'll have to see if I can find it.
It's also available online because I found it in digital form a couple of weeks back. Yeah, particularly the famous chart from inside of there.
Yeah.
So the book is asserting that Baptist is the true religion.
Correct. It's our version. By the way, it's our version of apostolic. In my opinion, it's our version of apostolic succession. But that may not be a fair way to label it, but it's the same concept. But we'll talk about it.
That's right, because we come from John the Baptist.
Yeah. Yeah. Or not. Yeah.
Come from Noah.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Yeah. We're certainly going to claim, we can directly tie ourselves back to Adam. And then one of their kids, Seth, went off and formed Second Baptist of Garden of Eden, shortly after that. So,
well, that's a given.
Yeah, it is a given. They probably argued over the color of the carpet in the garden too. So, Okay, we'll come back to that because that is a part of how we define ourselves, whether we come out of a Reformed tradition that's been modified. I hold the position that what's true about the Trail of Blood, since we were on it now, is that it is true that out of the Reformed tradition, Baptists found something that was refound and reestablished what was akin to the first century church because of the Reformation process. So whether you believe it's a long line of that doctrinal succession, or whether it's just that the Reformation allowed us to go back and find the true church, either way we get to the same end, which is holding, I think, to something that is doctrinally more connected to the first century church. Either way, I think that's a fair way of describing it. Maybe that's a compromise way of describing it, but I think it's a fair way of describing it. So we're not going to have time to go into incredible detail here, but let's go ahead and at least get the start of this picked out. The Fourth Lateran Council is called in 1215. It was actually called in 1213, didn't happen to 1215. So it had the benefit of a couple of years of notice so that a lot of people could manage to come. And you see different accounts, but there were definitely over 1,000 people in clerical offices that attended this council. It's probably closer to 2,000. So it's often called the Great Council because it covered a lot of topics, as you can see here. But it's also often called the Great Council just because there were a bunch of folks there. It was probably the biggest ecumenical council in the history of the church in terms of the number of attendees. And each of these councils outputs what are known as canons or canonical law. Canons is a term that's often used to refer to religious law or religious pronouncements, although it's also a legal term. But the canon here, the canon law output is these are the things that were written down. These were the points. And the Fourth Lateran Council has something like 60 or 70 canons that are part of it. So they produced a lot of output from this particular council. So it's sometimes referred to as the Great Council, either because of the attendees and or because of the quantity of what they produced. We're going to go through the things that you see here in some detail next week, because it is relevant to go through and talk about what are all these things and where they come from. But generally, among the things that came out of the Fourth Lateran Council were the church's position on transubstantiation, what happens during the communion and whether that actually becomes the body and blood of Christ. That was one of the first things that came out of what they said here. The status of papal supremacy. We're going to talk a little bit more about who Innocent III is, because he's a big advocate for that. A requirement that folks confess at least annually. You have to go and have at least an annual confession. The church's position on usury. The church actually here defines marriage as a sacrament for the first time of the church. There are requirements for Jews and Muslims to wear special dress to identify themselves outwardly in terms of how they appear. And no marriage could be undertaken by a Christian to a Jew knowingly so. If you knew they were a Jew and you were a Christian, you were forbade inside the church from marrying them.
Wait. Why would the church think that they have any right to tell the Jews and Muslims what to do?
We're going to talk about that.
Okay.
Tithes were given preference over taxes. This is a little bit more of that church over state scenario. If you can only afford one, pay the church first. Various condemnations of heresies going all the way back to the Arian heresy were confirmed. And then new heresies were also identified and clarified as such. And because we've only had 4 of them so far, and we need to do it a little bit more, and the last one ended so badly with us sacking Constantinople, us being the Western Church, there was a call for the continuation of crusades and establishing under what mode or method the crusades would continue. So all of this happened at the Fourth Lateran Council. And we'll spend some time going through each of these things inside of this, because this now does tie back to the purpose of our study, which is not history for history's sake, but understanding how history influenced doctrine and our theology and how we got to where we are. But much of what you see here is setting up the final pieces on the stage for what will be the things that sparked the Reformation.
Okay, I know you want to discuss this next week, but just got to ask you one question. When it said no marriage between Christians and Jews, so who was that to benefit for the Christians or for the Jews?
They would tell you it was to benefit the Christians because they should not be associating in that way with the Jews.
So they were saying the Jews were not Christian.
Oh, most definitely.
Okay.
Was this ethnic Jews or actually practicing? Was it more an emphasis on the practice of Judaism, or was it against actually the any person of Jewish heritage?
Both.
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 So even a Jew who had been converted to Christianity
was a Jew that had been converted to Christianity was accepted inside of Christianity. But I'll see if I can find the quote since you raised that question because it's out there. It was even written by someone about this time. If you are a Jew that converts to Christianity, don't go back. It's actually worse for you if you were a Christian for any period of time and then you revert back to your Judaism. You're better off as if you never converted over. So it carried with it, and there was still a distinction made even for Jews who had converted. And a number of Jews in the period of time after this did convert because of pressures to convert. Eventually we get to things like the Spanish Inquisition, where it's, you have a choice for the most part, which is convert or die. And for example, shortly after this, Jews, for the most part, are completely kicked out of England for the better part of multiple centuries. One of the lecturers I was listening to yesterday who was trying to describe this said that one of her colleagues, who was more of an expert in that area of history, said, it will help you to think of it this way when you're reading some of the things that were written in England about Jews at that time and how they were portrayed, is that insert the word space alien when you see the reference to Jew. And the concept there was, it was just about as likely that English person would have met a space alien as they would have met a Jew, because all of the Jews had fled from England. So it was easy to say things about this group of people that you had no day in, day out direct encounter with. That's how foreign it was, for example, for a lot of people in England in the 13th and 14th century when they thought about Jews. The Jews had all gone, or they converted. They had no. Well, think about some of even Shakespeare's portrayal of Jews in the Shakespearean plays being a good example there. That's a latter expression of the ideas about who Jews were, but was very common inside of English thought for a long period of time. Yeah, so we'll talk a little bit about that. The Crusades even took an element of, on the way, some of the latter Crusades, on their way over to the Holy Land, actually persecuting Jews in Europe on the way.
They always consider the Holy Land as Jewish. But
that's a modern note. That's one of those tricky modern notions, Billy.
Yeah.
We think of it that way now because we're post World War II and post the reestablishment of the nation of Israel. But when they were launching the Crusades, it was going to seize the land back because of Christ, not because of. We're going back to seize it because of Christ, not because of David, or not because of Moses.
Well, that's clear as mud.
Yeah. All right. We'll pick back up here with more the details of the Fourth Lateran Council, and again, that will set the stage very nicely for us getting into the real meat of the matter, which is the Reformation. Any questions? More questions before I stop the recording? All right.